Good evening. From our headquarters in Kiev, this is the Sunday show on Hromadske International, the only primetime TV program explaining the Eastern European geopolitical storm in English, and I am Andrei Kulikov. The Ukrainian parliament goes on holidays without passing healthcare reform and only partially passing pension reform. MPs revealed the draft law on deoccupying the Donbas. What you need to know. NATO's Secretary General visits Kiev, our exclusive interview. The EU-Ukraine summit, what's new? The one-year anniversary of journalist Pavel Sheremet's murder. The Committee to Protect Journalists reports on where the investigation stands. And the former editor-in-chief of The Guardian discusses challenges to modern journalism and reflects on the British paper's coverage of WikiLeaks and Edward Snowden. Go to our webpage en.hromadske.ua to see full versions of our reports and interviews. Follow us on Twitter and Facebook. Search Hromadske International. We will be back in a second. A crazy last day for the Ukrainian parliament before it goes on holidays. Protests outside, tensions inside. The bottom line is healthcare reform wasn't approved, while pension reform passed in the first reading. The biggest fight was over 6 cases of taking away MPs' immunity for corruption. In 4 cases, MPs lost their immunity, including the former governor of Kharkiv and an opposition bloc member, Mr. Dobkin, and 2 high-profile deputies from the ruling Petro Poroshenko bloc and the Narodny Front, who have very close connections to the Ukrainian ruling elite, Mrs. Rosenblatt and Polakov, while 2 more, no less controversial MPs, remained untouchable, despite the pressure from anti-corruption activists. Throughout all of this, the Ukrainian Prime Minister Groysman showed his strength, making everything possible and succeeding in passing amendments to the Ukrainian budget. There were also a few scandalous bills, including one that would give the authorities the right to shut down online media without a court order, but they weren't voted upon. Another big issue which had been discussed in the Ukrainian parliament this past week was the so-called draft law on deoccupation. Hromadske broke the story after finally getting the copy of the draft law and publishing it. You may go to en.hromadske.ua and see for yourself. The parliament will consider the bill supposedly in autumn. The draft document made available to Hromadske does not contain transitional provisions, which is usually a case in the text of the bills. And the draft law is the first document on the nationwide level which actually puts down in writing the Russian Federation's occupation of Ukrainian territories. The bill also states that the President of Ukraine makes decision on the use of the armed forces and other military formations to deter and repel the armed aggression of the Russian Federation. The President can also decide to impose the martial law. We see this document as extremely important, and we are also looking at it as one of the many elements in negotiations regarding the Russia-Ukrainian conflict. According to our information, it has yet to be discussed with Ukrainian international partners. And here in the studio we have MP Ryabchyn, who represents Batkivshchyna faction. He's originally from Donetsk and he deals with this issue. I know that you yourself have applied many efforts to get the text of the law, to get acquainted with this, and we'd like to discuss the essence of the draft. But first, why do you think it is so hard to get?
First of all, I would like to thank you for choosing the topic for this program. But my first remark would be regard the definition, because in your introduction you said about the draft law, about the bill, about the law, but I would call it a document. Because what we could say about the draft law, it's the one that is registered in the parliament. And we already have 3 laws on so-called deoccupation of Donbas registered by our colleagues. That one that we are discussing right now, the document, the text that was leaked out in the media, it's not a draft of a law, it's, I don't know, a project. So it's hard to debate about some concept, let's say, about the document, but not about the draft of the law. This is a really big important, because what we have saw in the document, and the document itself, is non-professionally drafted ideas that yet to be developed. And the question is, myself personally, my colleague Alena Shkrum from Batkivshchyna faction, some other colleagues who already dealt or registered their type of the laws, they have an intention to join the working group, because this is a really serious issue.
But do they know who is in the working group?
Yeah, we started to ask the people who started communicating from, let's say, from the presidential side, from People's Front side, another political party that somehow informed the coalition and communicated this. And they said, you cannot enter any working group. I said, like, why? We would like to, because, for example, I, in a previous working group representing the universities in exile, made a really great impact on it, trying to solve this issue, and we already solved it. The colleague of mine, Alena Shkrum, for example, when she studied in Cambridge, she studied in the, like, one of her professors is current judge for the United Nations in the case of Ukraine, and she knows the international law. So we have a lot of great ideas how to protect the national interest. And we were stopped by our colleagues by entering this working group. And when we try to find it, where is the facility? Where is the person, where is the person who sits in the computer and just like doing the draft of the law? Because it's not the politician itself drafting the text. Politician gives the idea, and a lawyer or somebody is, puts it to the paper. Where is this like round table where there's discussion? Like, we couldn't find it. It was so secretly. It was so, it was so closed. So we had lots of questions whether it exists or it's just a communication. And what we find out, according to like my understanding of situation, this is not the genuine text of a law that will be presented, I don't know, by the president, by the cabinet of ministers, by Security Council, or whatever. So this is just like a test ball to receive some ideas, to receive some comments. This is a usual type of the thing that current government or current authorities is doing, and I don't think this is the best way to communicate with the people.
What can be the most delicate issues that they try to avoid by publishing or by leaking a document which is not actually a document, if we take your words for what they are?
The worst thing and the most dangerous thing is the political game, because this, the document itself should be the policy imposed. But this is not a policy, it's politics. It's pure politics. And this is the thing that worries me the most. Because in this text, you should unite first national interest. You should find a big compromise between the biggest political groups, factions that represent current parliament, and I guess the future parliament, because we definitely know that in a couple of years it will be another composition of the parliament. The current authority doesn't have a lot of support in the among the wide population, what the latest poll said. So you need to agree on the national level what are the next steps. This is the first thing. Second, you definitely need to agree this policy with our international partners that are backing up with the Russian war. And third, and maybe for me it's also very important, is like the people who lives in Donbas right now, because it will be the policy imposed on them, on their relationship with those who are now on the occupied territory. It should be the policy that will set to them and send a signal what will be with their job places, what will be with their school, kindergarten places, what will be with the cities. So it should be, really professional and sophisticated drafted. For this purpose, it needs to be discussed. Unfortunately, we don't have the discussion. We only have some, speculation in the media. We have the Russian response. They say, like, we hate what Ukrainians is doing. And this is, I guess, the reaction that the current authority was trying to achieve. Play the game on Russia, play the game on international community, improve the political situation here, but not to do the policy, what is the purpose of this conflict.
Before we go to the question of international partners, I was really impressed by you mentioning the people who live in the occupied areas and adjacent areas, because not so many politicians remember or mention those people. But what could you tell me and the Hromadske international viewers about how often such people are consulted at all? Maybe the fact that they've not been consulted about this supposed draft law is an exception, or is it a rule of current authorities?
We should differentiate, people who live in this occupied territory who still carry the Ukrainian passport. So for myself, being a Ukrainian politician, they are the Ukrainian citizen and they have the same right as another one. And we should call about so-called authorities or self-proclaimed people or, puppet administration. I don't want to speak about this. I don't want to speak about their thinking that they have some power. What I care about the people who are suffering there, and I guess their voice needs to be heard. How it can be heard? This is a really problem for the authorities. But for example, what I'm doing, I'm dealing with the exiled universities. We have more than 18 universities fled from Crimea and Donbas, and they are now relocated into the government area control, Donetsk and Luhansk area, to Vinnytsia, to Kiev. And they have professors, they have students have their families. Often they live in the occupied territories. And for example, we adopted a law that allows these students, these scholars, school people who just graduated from schools from Donetsk occupied and from occupied Luhansk to join the university in exile without all Ukrainian exam, let's say. If you're able to pass it, you could go and join Kiev, Kharkiv, Lviv, Odessa, and a lot of people are doing this even from the occupied territory. But if you are not able to do this because you have, emergency situation or some other, you still can go to Ukraine and join the Ukrainian universities. But I think that the governmental position is we're fighting for the territories, but not for the hearts and mind of the people. And this is the key solution to win this war with Russia.
All right, now to the international partners. When Hromadske was asking and searching actually for this document, we've been told a couple of times, or actually more than a couple of times, that this supposed draft law was aired to international partners and it got their approval or confirmation and things like that. However, when later our correspondents talked to international partners, it turned out that they have no idea about the document. You have quite a lot of international connections. What do you know about these international goings-on?
Let me put it that way. I'm pretty sure that our authorities, those who are trying to make this document, they spoke with our international partners about the concept. Not about the text, not about the whole text, the whole idea. Our international partners did not have the translation. They had, for example, when they asked, we have 5 ideas, and they told about 5 ideas that we will rearrange some management procedure on militaries, we'll do blah, blah, blah. So the concept itself, but how the concept will be implemented into the law. I also could write and register a law saying, blame Russia for everything. And it will receive the number, the title, and it will still heavily support. But the mechanism of implementation of this will be unknown. It will be just, fake law. The concept was discussed, but not sufficiently enough. For example, 2 weeks ago, I was in Berlin with the Heinrich Böll Foundation, and I had an opportunity to go to Chancellor Merkel's office and to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, because these are 2 different branches led by 2 different political leaders, Chancellor Merkel and now the representative of SDP, Social Democratic Party. And in both of these institutions, they were asking about this document. They heard about this, but they don't know any of the details. And before coming to Berlin, I was in Luhansk area and I was in Donetsk area. We will have the election in the amalgamated community in October, and we were with Batkivshchyna faction that I represent, speaking with the candidates, and I went to the local authorities asking, do you know about any of the detail? Because there are lots of rumors that Donetsk and Luhansk Oblast will be merged into the one, that will be different type of a management, that there won't be election. People on the ground also heard a lot of rumors, but never heard about the direct orders. This is not the right way to do the policy in Ukraine, especially in these territories. You need to communicate more with the people. We need to communicate more with the people who are responsible to represent the Ukrainian state there, because we're still fighting for the hearts and minds of these people, and they are all the time, trying to compare how it used to be, what is it right now, whether the roads have been built, whether the windows are restored. So people, I think not only in Donetsk and Luhansk, but all over in Ukraine, trying to assess the professionality of the current authority, and unfortunately is not the best, not the best example of how it used to be.
From what you know, Mr. Ryabchyn, how likely is it that the document and the concept, and obviously I understand that we still don't know the details, but will it agree or will it contradict the Minsk agreements? Won't it stand in the way of Minsk agreements?
The thing that irritates me in this law is that it's right that everything will be done according to the Minsk Accord or agreement. Let's say basically agreement is the best way to represent this type of a thing that was agreed in Minsk. But it's never been said about the constitution. In this law, like it said, everything is up to the Minsk Accord. No. Everything should be up to the constitution of Ukraine, and by elevating the status of the Minsk agreement and put it to the text of the law is not the best way, I would say, of protecting the national interest. Yes, in the first stage, the Minsk agreement helped to secure the situation in Ukraine, but it was a huge, let's say, mistake to put security issues and political issues to the one paper, and we see that it's not working. And let's imagine that if Minsk Accord led to the peaceful resolution to Donbas, that we started to ceasefire exchanges of the hostages, people return to their normal life, nobody will sad about this. But this mistake was been done by the authorities who signed it, who elevated it to the status that the United Nations Council signed. Also, it's agreed to the legal status, but to put it to the Ukrainian law, I think it would be the biggest mistake that we could do. It should be. We should do everything according to our constitution, not to put the Minsk agreement to the status of the law.
Thank you, Mr. Ryabchyn. Oleksiy Ryabchyn, an MP from Batkivshchyna faction, was the guest of Hromadske International, and we will be back with you in a second. They call it the gray zone, a snaking line of territory between government-controlled and occupied lands in the east of Ukraine. This is the area trapped in limbo at the center of Russia's war against Ukraine. Like over 1,600,000 Ukrainians from the east, many of the zone's residents have fled to more secure areas, but others have been unable to leave. And members of both groups face a serious problem. The Ukrainian military have encircled several of the villages, making it nearly impossible to enter or exit. The Ukrainian authorities consider these villages too damaged for habitation, but that means residents of the gray zone, both current and former, struggle to visit relatives, check on their old homes, attend school, or seek medical attention beyond the demarcation line. The war in Ukraine started in 2014, when Russian forces annexed Crimea and invaded Donbas. Since then, more than 10,000 people have been killed and about 24,000 injured in Ukraine, according to UN reports. According to the European Commission, the conflict in eastern Ukraine has affected over 4.4 million people, 3.4 million of whom are believed to be in need of humanitarian aid. Hromadske visited some of the frontline settlements in Donetsk region to see how some of the most isolated victims of the conflict are coping.
The village of Pivdene, where we are right now, is split in half. This territory is controlled by the Ukrainian army, but the gray zone, which starts just behind the Pivdene mine, is territory controlled by the so-called DPR. At first glance, it looks deserted, but this is not the case. People live on both sides of the boundary line, but they cannot cross it.
I usually bring bits of wood and don't go anywhere else.
Granny Katya is 92, and she lives in the part of Pivdene controlled by the Ukrainian army. Her family and seriously ill son live nearby in the territory controlled by the militants in Horlivka. This is almost a 2-kilometer journey, but she is not able to get there. You can't get to town from here?
Oh no, I can't get there. Who will let me go there? If they let me, maybe I could go. I don't have a permit. Here is the checkpoint. I went up to the guys and said, "Boys, you're one of us. I'm not a criminal."
It's the same in the Ukrainian-controlled territory. Residents of Pivdene that have ended up in the gray zone cannot get to the Ukrainian-controlled territory. There are none of the basic necessities, hospitals, shops, or schools. Almost 180 people live here. The soldiers have only allowed half of them to cross the blockade here in Pivdene. For the rest, the road is only open in one direction, into the so-called DPR. These so-called closed points are situated along the demarcation line. It's the front line where the positions of Ukrainian soldiers are located. In between them is the airport sector where military action took place in 2014-2015. The conflict center has now shifted, but access is still blocked even for the locals. Pisky is also closed off. In 2014-2015, locals were not able to take the bodies of people that died in the shelling. They just buried them in the courtyards. Ludmila is an IDP from Pisky. She now lives in Hromadske, but dreams of going back home. This is not possible at the moment. To come here, residents have to get a pass from the soldiers every time. They often deny this request. While the residents are not able to go back to their homes, there are strange things happening in Pisky. Someone has opened up the flats and the property from inside has disappeared. Ludmila's neighbor, who works for the police, detained a truck from the 128th Brigade carrying metal gates which were removed from private buildings and garages. Earlier, soldiers from the 93rd Brigade were also caught. Criminal cases were started.
I come here on my bike. They have taken metal gates from all our neighbors. I can't get my gates back because they're being held in the District Department of Internal Affairs as evidence.
We know that such cases have happened, and they have been quite active at practically all points of contact. There are no 100% perfect people. It is clear that in any unit there are scumbags that allow themselves to behave like that. At the start of the military action, visitations to the housing estates were limited because there were a lot of civilian victims. The front line, like any front line, should be closed to the civilian population. In order to facilitate access for the residents to visit their homes, the local authorities have promised numerous times to set up civil-military administrations. The Donetsk Regional Administration appealed to the administration of the President of Ukraine to set up a civil-military administration in several villages in eastern Ukraine, according to a response from the Donetsk Regional Administration to one of the humanitarian organizations. However, the head of the Donetsk Civil-Military Administration, Pavlo Zhebrivsky, seems to have changed his mind.
Now, there are 11 people living in Pisky, and in fact, they live like one family with the soldiers. At the moment, in my opinion, there is no point in spending money on introducing a civil military administration in Pisky. Our authorities can't come to Pisky and tell people to their faces that they won't have buses, electricity, gas, and that no one plans to create a civil military administration there.
People continue to hope that the officials are listening, otherwise they will be prepared to take more drastic action. People warn that if there is no solution, they will come here to the checkpoint, to Pisky, without permission.
самовольно, если их не пустят.
NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg visited Ukraine this week. In Kyiv, he spoke before the Ukrainian parliament, where MPs are urging NATO to increase support for Ukraine and speed the creation of a membership action plan for Ukraine. In his address, Stoltenberg sought to reassure Ukraine of NATO's support. He stressed that the military alliance's doors remain open and cooperation with Ukraine is strong. However, much depends on Ukraine itself. Most importantly, Kyiv must fight corruption and focus on reforms. Stoltenberg voiced his support for Ukraine's territorial integrity and condemned Russia's annexation of Crimea and support for separatists in Ukraine's east. The Secretary General emphasized that NATO is partnering with Ukraine to increase the country's cybersecurity. He also promised NATO support for wounded Ukrainian soldiers. In Hromadske's exclusive interview, we've asked Secretary General Stoltenberg more about what the future holds for Ukraine's relations with NATO.
Secretary General, focus on reforms, meet NATO standards, fight corruption. Though, so I'm quoting you. That's very extremely important message. While we are in an environment when there is more focus, the easiest to achieve goal. So would you name one or two priorities, especially for NATO, regarding those issues? For instance, civil oversight of a Ministry of Defense or something like that, one or two.
The most important thing is to be successful in the fight against corruption, because corruption is hindering and hampering all the other efforts. That's the reason why we have something called Building Integrity, which is a NATO program where we work together with Ukraine on how we can advise and help Ukraine being more successful in the fight against corruption. NATO cannot solve that problem for Ukraine. It has to be Ukraine and Ukrainian leaders that solve the problem, but we can help, we can support, and we can share the experience and advices we have from other countries which have made progress in the fight against corruption.
A few times, many times, you've mentioned the NATO door is open for Ukraine. That's a part of your message. While a lot of the Ukrainian, including Ukrainian politicians, not like that, urge, like, can we speed up? When we would have the, how we can develop with the Ukraine-NATO membership action plan. And there is a legitimate concern that inaction in our part of the world, it provokes those who threaten. We do have this experience. So really, what would be this answer? Understanding that might be the Ukraine would join NATO way later than Ukrainians expect. But what would be this policy? How would you define Ukraine-NATO relations within the nearest future? Would it stay the same, or there is anything planned?
The plan is to strengthen our partnership and to work more closely together on many different areas. For instance, on cyber, we are doing a lot and we are stepping up. NATO will provide equipment. We will strengthen the cyber defenses of key Ukrainian institutions, help Ukraine to do so, and also helping Ukraine to develop capabilities to investigate and to attribute who is behind the different cyber attacks. That's one area where we do a lot and where we can step up and do even more, and it's extremely relevant as a response to hybrid threats, hybrid warfare. Then we are also doing a lot when it comes to meeting NATO standards, interoperability, meaning how Ukrainian military forces can strengthen and improve the way they're able to work together with NATO forces. That's good for Ukraine, but it's also good for NATO. On the membership issue, the main message from NATO is that it's a sovereign decision by Ukraine whether it wants to apply or not, and then it's a decision by 28 allies on whether NATO is ready to enlarge and to have a new member. No one else has the right to interfere in that process. The President raised the issue of a membership action plan. It was not discussed in depth, but the main issue is that Ukraine already has the tools to make progress moving closer to NATO with the comprehensive assistance package, which is a wide-ranging package of many different strands of cooperation, and we are following up and implementing all these strands of efforts.
Deterrence and defense, that's what always mentioned. And there was a decision to deploy 4 battalions in Poland and the Baltic states. We extensively covered that as a journalist and pay attention to that. But right after that, there was the announcement by the Russian side, by the President, Minister of Defense, to deploy 30 battalions to the western border of Russia. Then later there was issues about the divisions and even tactical battalions. So what can NATO and what can you do to stop this spiral, at the same time ensuring the safety of those who are there?
For NATO, it is extremely important to respond in a measured and proportionate way. And there can be no doubt that when NATO now is increasing our military presence in the eastern part of our alliance, in the Baltic countries and the Black Sea region, that's a response to the aggressive actions of Russia in Ukraine. No one thought about, no one was discussing this kind of military presence in the east before Russia illegally annexed Crimea and started to destabilize eastern Ukraine. So we are responding, but at the same time we are responding in a proportionate and measured way, because we don't want a new arms race, we don't want a new Cold War. Russia is there to stay, Russia is our neighbor, so therefore we convey the message of defense and dialogue. We need to be firm, we need to be predictable, but at the same time we need to try to avoid tensions escalating and creating an even more difficult relationship with Russia.
Do you think you're successful in that?
I think that without the measured but firm response of NATO, we would have a much more uncertain situation in Europe. By deploying troops to the eastern part of the alliance, we are sending a clear message that an attack on one NATO ally will trigger the response from the whole alliance, because these forces are multinational, and thereby sending a very strong message of deterrence, a multinational response to any attack against any NATO ally. At the same time, we have been able to re-establish dialogue with Russia, and I think that's important, because especially when tensions run high, it is important to talk.
There would be Russia would have the military trainings in Belarus this autumn called West. So we heard from especially the Baltic partners, they are concerned. Do you share that concern? Would there be any NATO observers? How would you treat that?
We will monitor and follow the Zapad exercise closely. All nations have the right to exercise their forces, but they should do that in a responsible way, and they should of course do it in accordance with international agreements and regulations, for instance, and commitments, for instance, the Vienna document, which is a document that requires international observation and notification of big military exercises. And we call on Russia to do exactly that when it comes to the Zapad exercise.
If you speak about the trusts created for Ukraine by NATO, what could we improve in their work in terms of transparency, quality, and the speed of use of those funds allocated there?
For us, transparency when it comes to the use of the NATO trust funds is fundamental, and therefore we are transparent on what we do in Ukraine. And actually one of the purposes with some of the funds and some of the NATO programs and activities is to create more transparency, is to be extremely open on what kind of activities and programs we are working for here in Ukraine.
So almost we have very short time to answer that, but we've listened carefully, we've been and listened to President Trump talking again and again, last time in Warsaw, on the 2% of the GDP of the NATO members, which is good for allies. At the same time, there are worries by the NATO members about unclear positions sometimes of the President Trump. You're in a position where you have to put the allies together. You don't need to confront or alienate anybody. But still, what would be your message to the US leadership to make this cooperation easier also for the partners? What are your concerns?
So my message is that it's absolutely possible to have a very ambitious but also positive message on defense spending, deterrence and NATO's collective defense. Because we are starting to deliver. European allies are now actually starting to really increase defense spending for the first time in many, many years. Over the last 3 years, total defense spending across Europe and Canada has increased by around $46 billion, which is a significant amount of money for defense, for investments in equipment and capabilities. When it comes to partners, I strongly believe that a strong NATO, collective defense, deterrence in Europe, help to stabilize the whole of Europe. So it's also, of course, important for countries like Ukraine, Georgia, countries in the Western Balkans who are not members of NATO, but of course they benefit from the stabilizing effect a strong and predictable NATO has on the whole security situation in Europe. And some of the money we invest in defense is also spent in programs and activities where we work together with Ukraine in modernizing, improving the armed forces of Ukraine, because we strongly support the independence and the territorial integrity of Ukraine.
So no concern with the US?
US is committed to NATO, and that's not only in words but also in deeds. The US is now increasing their military presence in Europe for the first time in many, many years. And I think the fact that the US is leading one of the battalions, the battalion or the battle group we have in Poland, but also are increasing their military presence in Europe on top of that, with more funds for exercises, for pre-positioned equipment, supplies and forces. I think that's the strongest possible sign and commitment to NATO and to the US security guarantees for Europe.
Ukraine recently reached a visa-free regime with the European Union, and since then many have been wondering what will come next. This week, the 19th EU-Ukraine summit took place in Kyiv, with officials like the European Council President Donald Tusk and European Commission President Jean-Claude Juncker in attendance. They discussed the future of Ukraine's bilateral relations with the EU. President Petro Poroshenko also shared Ukraine's plans for deepening integration. Here's Hromadske's report on the events.
Ukraine has proved that it can't be defeated by outside enemies, but it can be defeated by itself, stated the President of the European Council, Donald Tusk, at the beginning of the Ukraine-EU summit in Kyiv on July 13th. With every visit, Tusk's Ukrainian gets better.
Він говорить, що далі вільніше і з меншим акцентом українською мовою.
Ви маєте будь-що тримати свою єдність і уникати внутрішніх конфліктів, як джуми. Я завжди це повторював своїм співвітчизникам, коли був прем'єр-міністром Польщі. Я повторюю це сьогодні всій Європі.
The President of the European Commission, Jean-Claude Juncker, also arrived in Kyiv, and he pinned down the main issue in today's agenda between the EU and Ukraine.
What we are asking, without lecturing the country, because this is a country which has not to be lectured, is to increase the fight against corruption, because corruption is undermining all the efforts this great nation is undertaking. And so we were offering to the President this morning, President Tusk and myself, an intermediary way how to deal with this problem when it comes to jurisdictions. Till now, the European Union was requesting between brackets, from Ukraine to create a special court in charge of corruption affairs.
The President of Ukraine, Petro Poroshenko, was very positive. He announced a list of Ukrainian plans for the next few years to deepen its integration with Europe.
From the perspective of Ukraine, it wants to join the European Union Customs Union, integrate into the Schengen zone, and become a part of the digital market or energy union. It is a powerful impetus for implementing economic, social, and other reforms.
The main intrigue of the 19th EU-Ukraine summit was that there was no common declaration in the end.
The most important part of the most important document, I mean the association agreement. It's not a slogan. After visa liberalization decision, after association agreement and DCFTA, this is our new reality. And I want just to repeat this quote. The European Union acknowledges the European aspirations of Ukraine and welcomes its European choice.
The main controversy of the 19th EU-Ukraine summit was that there was no joint statement at the end. The practice of not issuing a statement after high-ranking meetings is not unusual for the EU, and in this case, the association agreement remains the legally binding document for cooperation. Nevertheless, this was a disappointment for the Kyiv government because they anticipated such a statement as a symbolic gesture underlining EU support for Ukraine. The Ukraine-EU summit in Kyiv demonstrated the unity between the EU and Ukraine. The EU assertively announced that sanctions against Russia for its actions against Ukraine have been prolonged for 6 months. However, it became obvious that the EU expects concrete reforms from Ukraine. Now is the start of a new stage in Ukraine and the EU's bilateral relations, concluded the summit, as almost 100,000 Ukrainians have already used the visa-free regime with the EU.
There was also another controversy, as Jean-Claude Juncker said that rather than an anti-corruption court, a special chamber dealing exclusively with anti-corruption issues might be formed. This has created room for speculation about whether the EU had given up on the anti-corruption court. After all, creating the court was one of the key Ukrainian commitments and also a condition for further cooperation with the International Monetary Fund. We can clarify that Juncker's comment was referring to a provisional measure that could be created before October 2017, Ukraine's next IMF deadline. The Committee to Protect Journalists, CPJ, has released a special report on the murder of journalist Pavel Sheremet. The report raises serious questions about the efficacy of Ukrainian law enforcers' investigation. Sheremet was killed last year in a car bombing as he drove to work in central Kiev. Since then, the drawn-out official investigation into his murder has produced few results, while investigative journalists have uncovered a number of significant details. For this reason, CPJ decided to investigate the investigation. The organization's report builds upon important revelations from the documentary film Killing Pavel, a joint project by Hromadske's investigative unit Slidstvo.info and the International Organized Crime and Corruption Reporting Project. In the film, journalists identified a former agent of the Ukrainian Security Services, SBU, and 2 unidentified assassins who were present outside Sheremet's apartment when the explosives were planted under his car. We spoke to Alan Rusbridger, a member of CPJ's board of directors and the former editor-in-chief of Britain's The Guardian, to learn more about CPJ's findings.
Committee to Protect Journalism is doing that report on the murder of Pavel Sheremet here in Ukraine. There are a lot of details in that, but what would be the main finding and advice?
Well, it's really an investigation into the investigation. So it's looking at this year-long attempt to find the killers of Sheremet, and trying to find out why it's so complicated and why they haven't come up with any leads at the moment. So that's the job of the CPJ, is to apply pressure and scrutiny so that when journalists get into trouble or are killed, there's an international organization that is impartial and can ask sometimes awkward questions about why there is apparent impunity in countries and it's very easy to murder journalists.
So what would be the advice in that particular case? Because you are coming to some conclusion, not of the investigation of the murder itself, but of the situation.
Well, obviously, none of us knows why Sheremet was murdered. But I think I've been very struck in the last couple of days. I've met the police, I've met the SBU, I've met the president, I've met the prosecutor general. And we keep being told that the best cops are on the case, they've got unlimited resources, that they've got enormous files full of material, they've interviewed 3,000 witnesses, and so on and so on. And yet, that film that came out, Killing Pavel, came up with really quite significant evidence that the police had missed. And so it makes you question how good this investigation really is and how determined they are to get at the truth.
So what could you see as the representative of the organization, that what could be further after your talks, after your meetings? What else could be done in that?
The danger, I think, with the investigation is that, of course, there are a number of possible motives. But one of the possible motives is political, that Pavel Sheremet was a very well-known journalist, and maybe there is something that he has written or people that he's upset who wanted to silence him. And the accusation is that by having the police and the SBU investigating, they're in a sense marking their own homework. They're looking into themselves. And so how could you reassure the public and, importantly, the family that this is not the case, that there are external eyes on this investigation that will make sure that it is honest and rigorous and is going to come up with the answers?
There was as for me, a bit awkward discussion here about the way that the journalists led the investigation when we're speaking about the Killing Pavel movie. And there was some criticism that they could have provided the police with the evidence they have rather than the due investigation on what police hadn't done. What is your view on that?
Well, it's I think it's fairly easy, really. These are journalists. They were skeptical about the police investigation. In a sense, the film was about the gaps in the police investigation, and you can see from that film that they had quite a degree of skepticism about whether the police were really doing the job. So I think it was perfectly justified for them to make their own investigation and hand over the material at the end. That's what journalism is. Journalism has to be independent of everybody else.
For 20 years, Alan Rusbridger ran one of the most important British papers, The Guardian. Under his leadership, the paper ran the WikiLeaks story and Edward Snowden's revelations about the US National Security Agency's surveillance program. Later, WikiLeaks founder Julian Assange, who initially appeared to be fighting for free information, showed his political preferences and strongly criticized Hillary Clinton, while Snowden ended up in Russia. My colleague Natalia Humenyuk asked how the former editor of The Guardian reflects on their coverage today. And they also talked about fake news, financial difficulties, and political pressures, which are all rapidly changing today's media environment.
There is some feeling and sentiment in some of the public that journalists are devote too much time on the media. And for instance, we do have this, even with the American president, of the tweets of Donald Trump regarding the wrestling on CNN, that, that aren't we overdoing this threat to us, like trying to do that, we ask for a special attitude.
Well, I think we're beginning to glimpse what a world without journalism is like. And that's for two reasons. One is the economic predicament of the press, and one is the political control of the press. And it's frightening. I think people see what a world without facts is like, and when you can't tell what's true and what's not true. And so I think people are more appreciative now of what journalism can do, but they're also very suspicious and mistrustful of it. And so I think journalism has to keep reminding people why it can be trusted, what it can do, why it's needed, because there's a ton of information out there which is not being produced by journalism, And some of it's very good and some of it isn't. And we have to keep making the case as to what we do and why we deserve people's trust.
Generally, what could be the mistakes of modern times the media could avoid? Being, you know, a bit lost, I think, I would argue, a bit lost in this current environment of disinformation, fake news, social media, you know, platforms being developed.
Well, there's a radical, revolutionary change in the way that information is circulating now. I think of it as a difference between a vertical world in which journalists pass the information down to people, to a horizontal world in which there's an ocean of information that is changing opinions, influencing things, and some of that is bad, as you say, some of that is fake, some of it's true. But it's very, very powerful. And I think the worst thing that journalists can do is to cling to the old-fashioned mode and say, well, we want to go back to that vertical world where we own the information and we gave it to you. You realize that we are hopelessly out of touch with the way that information is now changing. And that means we have to earn trust by being more honest and transparent about our sources. It means we have to change the tone of voice. We have to have more of a conversation with the public rather than lecturing them. We have to reassess what journalism is doing. I mean, I'm very hopeful, but I'm only hopeful if journalists can wake up and realize that the world is changing faster and more radically than I think they're willing to admit at the moment.
It was under your leadership when The Guardian, together with a few other international papers, ran the WikiLeaks story, the first, like really the biggest there, investigation. And there was a lot of debates, there were books written about that, films made. Yet we are in the situation when WikiLeaks currently looks like a very partisan organization of Julian Assange. It played a role also in the US elections, takes a very clear political position rather than just being a platform which is, you know, all about the free access to the data. Having the relations with, some of the relations with Russia, if we speak about the RT, Russia Today TV channel. So after a couple of years, how do you reflect on that? How do you reflect on what you've done, on how you ran that story, to what it led? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I'll always defend the journalism we did in The Guardian. Julian Assange went off and did other things with his data, and that's up to him, and I don't defend that, but I'll defend the work that we did together, and that was a process of editing. So we did old-fashioned editing. And we did the same with Edward Snowden. He gave us the material and said, you edit it, and I don't want to edit it, you make your choices. And I think we did that responsibly and in the public interest. And I also want to make the point about the public interest and how it can't be for the state to define what the public interest is. Really important for journalists to remember that because I've heard this since being in Ukraine, that there's a sort of, if you're not patriotic, then there's a problem with your journalism. It's not up to journalists to be patriotic in their journalism. I mean, I can be patriotic as a citizen, but I'm independent of the state. And almost at a time of war or stress or conflict, it's more important to remember that. You have a duty as a journalist which is different from your role as a citizen.
You've mentioned that The Guardian ran the WikiLeaks and the Snowden story in a responsible way. But then there is a situation is longer than that piece, you know, you followed the story. But still, sometimes there is a responsibility of the media which kind of give birth to huge phenomenon. So still I would follow up on that. Did you have any thoughts about what happened to the WikiLeaks later and what role they're playing now, and also with the pretty dubious situation with Edward Snowden being not somewhere else as in Russia? Well,
I mean, WikiLeaks and Snowden, I think, are very different animals. They're very different. And I don't think, I honestly don't think Edward Snowden ever wanted to be in Russia. I don't think that was his life plan. that he saw himself spending the rest of his life in Russia. And I think he's been quite critical of the Russians. But I think generally, as journalists, you have to sort of set aside the source. And you look at the material and you say, what is this material telling us? The source may have many different motives, good and bad. And I think generally you try and push the source out of the mind and you look at the documents and you say, well, what are these documents? Is there a public interest in these documents? And you have to be prepared to defend those public interests. But as I say, when we did the Snowden story, I was asked to go to the Parliament, and the first question they asked me was, do you love your country? How can you be a journalist publishing this and at the same time love your country? And my answer was, but the thing I love about my country is that it's free, that the journalists can behave like this. That's what George Orwell was trying to write about in 1984, and we have to remember these lessons, otherwise what are we defending if we're not defending that basic freedom?
If you speak about generally from what the Committee for Protect Journalists is doing and the probably rather global answer, the journalists feel insecure because though there were always issues with politicians and governments, there were not so many deliberate attacks on the media. You know, the journalists still, your press jacket would help you in the conflict if you are, and it's exactly now when you're would be threatened just exactly why you're a press. And the press would be blamed. And press used to be blamed by a lot of authoritarian leaders, but you have it everywhere. So do you really see that, how we can answer that?
Well, I think we have to, if we're doing stuff that is important, that matters, then we will have supportive people. That's really important. You know, when we were doing the Snowden story, I had a very strong sense that people wanted us to do that story. Some people didn't, but sufficient people did. And so we have to keep rethinking what journalism is, why what we're doing matters, and we have to be true to that. I mean, I have to say, since coming to Ukraine, I've met some really inspiring journalists. I mean, people who are formidably resilient and determined in a young country, who do realize the importance of what they're doing. And if I could bottle that and take that back to London and show that to some jaded old journalists who are chasing ratings because that's where they're advertising, I think that would be a wonderful thing. So, you know, don't lose sight of what you're doing here in this country and some very important lessons that the rest of the world could learn from you.
And with this, from us all, the entire team of Hromadske International, goodbye until we meet next week.